Art turned down the podcast to say that young listeners can be impulsive. The trick is keeping them around long enough to become regular listeners. This is what the algorithm tells me, and my own observations seem to observe it.
That's right. It's all for the algorithm, baby.
Ugh.
Welcome to Science Fiction Book Club, a podcast for bookworms and stargazers. In every episode, we dive into the pages of our favorite science fiction novels to break down the big ideas, ask the nerdy questions, and maybe, just maybe, learn a little bit about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Osa, and with me, as always, Mr. Abu.
It's just a mining laser. It's not a gun.
That's what you'd like us to believe, huh?
Oh, so we are back to finish another novella in the Murderbot Diaries series.
That's right.
But, of course, before we dive in, let's take care of some housekeeping, as we always do. Beginning, of course, with our spoiler warning. Folks, today we are finishing up our read of Artificial Condition by Martha Wells. We're covering chapters 5 through 9, as the title states. So, before you continue listening, make sure that you, too, have finished reading this novella. And we also highly recommend you read the first novella in the series, which we have also covered on the podcast.
That's right.
So if you've read both of those novellas, you're good to go for today.
And as always, we certainly encourage you to read along with us and share your thoughts. So please email us at sci-fi-bookclubpod@loreparty.com. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/sci-fi-bookclubpod. You'll find there that we've got some free reading guides, discussion questions, and it's where you'll find all those bonus clips and bloopers. You'll also find our Discord, where we like to keep these nerdy sci-fi discussions going with our fellow readers in the community. And of course, all those links are in the show notes, so please take a look at those. It's why we have them, I guess.
That's right. You know, we put them there so that hopefully you click on them.
That's right.
That's the whole idea. All right, with housekeeping out of the way, here's the game plan for today's episode. No different than any other book club episode we do. We'll start by summarizing the chapters that were assigned for today's reading, 5 through 9. Then we will share our impressions of the book at this point, now that we've completed it. And finally, we'll wrap up by diving deep into our sci-fi analysis. So let's take a quick break, Opsa. Dear listener, don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're diving into the rest of this book.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track. And ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by the Toyota Grand Highlander. From daily routines to life-changing adventures, the Toyota Grand Highlander is spacious, powerful, and ready to take on life's grand challenges. Advanced safety features and innovative technology give you confidence for whatever life throws at you. And it's available in a hybrid Nightshade Special Edition, which includes sophisticated gloss black exterior accents and 20-inch black alloy wheels. Learn more at toyota.com/Grand Highlander. Toyota, let's go places.
Welcome back, listeners. Let's jump in with a brief summary of chapters 5 through 9, beginning, of course, with chapter 5, wherein we find a pretty action-packed scene as Murderbot is escorting its new clients from the transit ring to Ravi Hyrule, to truly no one's surprise. The young workers' former boss, Tlacey, attempts to kill them by sabotaging the shuttle. But fortunately, Murderbot and Art intervene to save the day, as we certainly hoped they would.
Yes.
And once on Ravi Hyrule, the young workers for some reason, still want to meet with
Oh my
Lacey,
god!
despite Murderbot continually and repeatedly telling them it's a terrible idea. This is obviously a trap.
You're gonna die.
You're gonna die. But unfortunately, its warnings go unheeded, and they end up making the meeting.
Yes.
Murderbot and Art are, of course, doing their utmost to keep an eye on the client's safety. Meanwhile, they're also searching through the archives to discover any info they can on the Ganaka Pit incident.
Yes.
Which was, of course, brushed under the rug, and its location is not totally advertised, but they're able to find some clues that end up eventually leading them there. Meanwhile, the meeting is wrapping up, and Murderbot notices that there are some goons kind of trailing behind them. It ends up getting into a fight with 3 of Lacey's agents who are clearly attempting to kill the young workers on the way to a hotel.
Right.
And this assassination attempt, the second one, in fact, is finally enough.
The second one in the same day.
The second one in the same day is finally enough to convince them that, Lacey was never going to give them their files back.
Oh, you think?
And Murderbot promises to get them off planet to safety.
And you know what? That's exactly what Murderbot does in Chapter 6. It gets its clients onto a private shuttle back to the transit ring. It doesn't even risk a public shuttle. They're going to go the extra mile, private. But Murderbot decides to stay behind because it still needs to figure out the truth about Ganaka Pit. Now, once it's at the former Ganaka Pit location, Murderbot starts searching through old archives. It powers up old computer terminals to find what it can. And ultimately, it learns that the incident, the massacre that occurred here, was a result of outside malware.
Yeah.
This malware infected the sec units and the bots of Ganaka Pit, and that is what ultimately led to the massacre of many of the workers there.
That's right. A little corporate espionage, as it were.
A little corporate espionage, right. A competing mining company.
That's right.
Attacked with this malware. Now, it continues to do some digging in the archives. It heads over to the comfort units, and it plugs into their archives, and it learns that actually this whole massacre was a mistake. The corporate espionage, the malware, was never meant to actually kill anyone. All it was supposed to do was infect the hauler bots that was moving the product, right? Moving the things they were mining.
That's right.
And basically disrupt the shipments. It was just a competing company trying to disrupt the shipments of Ganaka Pit so they could win. And it accidentally ended up in a bloodbath.
Right.
Murderbot also learns that the comfort units were quite heroic in their final moments. They put on a last stand, and during this chaos, they did their best to protect the humans and to reset the sex system to stop the chaos from happening. It sounds like all or most of the comfort units died in this attempt.
Right.
After having learned all of this, Murderbot makes its way back out from Ganaka Pit, back to Ravi Hyral proper, and comes back into range with Art. It's basically been so deep underground that it had to cut off communications. Once it's back in range, there's a message from Art.
And that message is that one of these young workers, Tapan, decided, I gotta stay behind. I gotta stay
Stop
behind.
it.
Clearly, this tip from a former coworker that claims to have files is legitimate.
Stop. What?
Yeah. 2 attempts weren't enough, apparently.
Mm-mm.
So once again, Murderbot has to baby a client and prepare for a meeting that will almost certainly end in its murder.
Yeah, no shit.
Meanwhile, one of the comfort units, affectionately known as a sex bot in this series,
that's right,
that's been employed by Lacey, has been tailing Murderbot. It ends up showing up at the hotel and reveals that it knows Murderbot is a rogue unit.
Uh-oh.
And it's clear from the tense interaction between them that the comfort unit actually hates Lacey and, in fact, wants to break free from her service. it even leaves a coded message for Murderbot saying, "Please help me." At this point, things are getting too dangerous. The heat is rising.
Truly.
So Murderbot convinces Tappan to go back to the transit ring and promises that it will instead meet with a coworker and get her files.
Okay. I'm sure this will go swimmingly. In Chapter 8, Murderbot does meet with Tappan's coworker, and things shockingly go perfectly fine.
Yeah.
The coworker has the files, Murderbot downloads them, they shake hands, and they part ways. Done
Easy.
and done.
No problem.
Easy peasy. Except Tappan was abducted by Tlacey's goons before she boarded the shuttle, and now Murderbot has to go save her. So we're in a big third act action scene. Murderbot goes to Tlacey's ship. There's a standoff with Tlacey. A bloody fight ensues in which Murderbot has to take out a bunch of guards. Ultimately, though, Murderbot is able to save both Tappan and the comfort unit.
So in Chapter 9, Murderbot ends up hacking the comfort unit's cover module and releases it of its own volition. Simply tells it to go away and not hurt anyone.
An interesting choice for Murderbot there.
Would certainly agree. And shortly after being healed in Art's medbay, Tappan is finally reunited with her friends, and Murderbot gets paid.
Finally. Underpaid, mind you. Murderbot took this job under market value.
That's right. Murderbot ends up saying goodbye to Art and the young workers and heads off on another cargo transport towards its next adventure.
Wherever that may be.
And scene.
So, Osa, how are you feeling? What do you think of Artificial Condition now that we've completed the novella?
Yeah, I ultimately am finding that I enjoyed this pretty straightforward novel as we rounded out the final chapters here. Given its length, I think Martha Wells did a pretty effective job of developing Murderbot's arc specifically, like Murderbot's individual arc, with mainly the other characters there to serve as productive foils for it and points of reference. I definitely would have loved to have seen Art get some more screen time.
Yes.
Even Tlacey, I will say, didn't have as much kind of background or context on her involvement in the Ganaka Pit massacre, or really any explanation as to why she had wanted to steal the files. But ultimately, with this being the Murderbot Diaries and being largely told from Murderbot's perspective, I found that this was a pretty effective short book. I also can't help but enjoy the fact that we're ourselves seeking a bit of escape and entertainment in this work of fiction, as the character Murderbot is doing the same, while also kind of exploring questions of identity and responsibility, topics that we talk a lot about, of course, on this podcast. Similarly, I think I rather enjoyed the somewhat transparent, to be fair, parallel between the supposedly homicidal machine Murderbot and the actually inhumane human Tlacey. Likewise with her goons, who are, not the best established characters, but I think that adds a little more nuance to what is otherwise a pretty straightforward story. Right. And as much as, I found myself wanting a little bit more of a complex explanation on the Ganaka Pit incident than the simple one that we were given, I do think that it was appropriately mundane. Like, corporate sabotage is, to me, one of the actual risks of powerful technologies and interconnected systems and globalism and someday, interplanetary capitalism. Right. So I don't know.
And you would imagine in Murderbot's hyper-capitalist society, in the world that Martha Wells has built here,
right,
this probably happens like every other Tuesday,
Exactly. Precisely. I mean, it doesn't seem like what happened in book 1 with Deltfall and Grey Christ, for example, was all that out of the norm for this society. So I found myself, relatively satisfied that we didn't actually get quite as deep of a mystery per se. There weren't that many layers to unpack. It's really just kind of context and setting for really what ends up being more of Murderbot's inner journey.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know. Anyways, how did you kind of feel about this book as we rounded out these chapters?
I felt a little, I'm going to be a bit harsher than you.
Yeah.
The first half of the book really grabbed me. I already stated in our last episode where we covered the first half that I loved Art as a new character in this series. I liked the relationship between Murderbot and Art, and I was hopeful that we were headed in an interesting direction with Ganaka Pit and some big revelations to come.
Right.
None of which happened. I think I can't help but feel really, really disappointed in the second half of this novella. Just to get a little bit more specific about the issues that irked me here. One, I did not like these young workers. Like, they barely had any personalities. None of them were ever really memorable in the way that Mensa and Rati and the
Right.
other characters in Preservation Ox were in the first book.
Right.
They weren't not fleshed out in any way. They were just kind of there as like background accessories to the story to give Murderbot something to do,
Right.
which I was quite disappointed by. I think I also voiced a concern in the previous episode that we were going to retread ground from the first book, which is like exactly what happened, Lovable, kind of dumb crew that Murderbot has to protect from themselves and
Right.
ends up kind of liking. I feel like we already did that in the first book. I think the larger problem I had with this young crew is that what were the stakes for these files? Why do I care if these people get their files back?
Right. Right.
Are there any real emotional stakes outside of this is a project we really worked on and we want it back?
Yeah.
I don't buy that if you survived 2 assassination attempts on your life, that
Yeah.
you would still be desperate to get,
Yeah.
If someone stole this podcast from us,
All right.
like some Italian mobster stole Sci-Fi Book Club from us,
Yeah.
and was like trying to kill us, I'd be like, yo, it's yours.
It's yours. Take it, please.
Take it. I don't
Yeah.
want anything to do with this podcast anymore.
Right. Right.
So I found that really unsatisfying. I wasn't sure why anyone should care about these files. And so that like really took away from the tension of basically anything that was happening in the
Fair
second
enough.
half of the story. There were also a number of repetitive plot elements, right? Like the kids are getting on the shuttle, they're not on the shuttle. They're on the shuttle, they're not on the shuttle.
Right.
We're having a tense meeting with Talasi. Now we're having another tense meeting with Talasi.
Right.
Like the elements that weren't Ganaka Pit were basically just copy pasted over and over again, which I found disappointing.
Right.
And speaking of Talasi, kind of a nothing burger of an antagonist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of a nothing burger of a final showdown.
It
Like there
was
seemed
quite
to be
quick.
some hint toward Ganaka Pit,
Right.
maybe.
Right.
But then everyone started shooting and then it was all over.
Right. Right.
So who knows what that was all about. Again, no emotional stakes for me there. I was not invested in anything that happened to Talasi. On top of that, I do want to touch on Ganaka Pit. I won't say too much here because my takeaway later is a lot about this. But I too was disappointed with this reveal, with this like very mundane reality of what happened here.
Yeah.
I felt it was, maybe it made sense in the universe that it was corporate espionage, corporate sabotage, like that sort of thing probably happens all the time here. That's great. But as a story in a book that I'm reading, I found it to be really lackluster. And I'm walking away from this book just as confused as Murderbot is by the end with everything that happened on Ganaka Pit. The reveal as a storytelling device doesn't add any layers of complexity to Murderbot in any way that's interesting. And if anything, I would argue it actually makes Murderbot more generically like heroic and a protagonist. It kind of makes him less interesting
Yeah.
that his hands were actually totally clean in the Ganaka
Right.
massacre.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it actually takes away layers of complexity because up
Right.
until now we've assumed, Murderbot killed a bunch of people and it has to grapple
Right.
with that fact.
Right.
Now we learn that actually Murderbot's totally innocent.
Right.
Makes Murderbot less interesting in my
Right.
eyes.
Right.
I'll wrap up. I'm being like super negative. So, and I don't want to come off as like I hated this book or anything. It was another fun adventure in the Murderbot Diaries, but for me it was kind of a forgettable one. I will say art was the memorable part of this book.
Absolutely.
And I'm absolutely livid that
Yeah.
art got sidelined
Yes.
in the second half.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
Art just becomes like the quote unquote guy in the chair that talks to
Right.
Murderbot in the
Right.
ear
Right.
and doesn't really have direct involvement in any of the
Right.
plot events outside of helping Murderbot do stuff.
Right.
So,
Right.
Justice for art. I want art back in future novels, and
Yeah.
I want art to have a bigger role.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I will say I don't disagree with any of your criticisms. I think part of my personal enjoyment was in kind of treating this as really episode 2 of a longer kind of series.
Yeah.
And in that kind of vein, I think I can accept a little repetition and maybe a little less substance in the hope that we're building up to a more satisfying takeaway in future novels. But of course, that doesn't do much for Talisi or for art, justice for the villain and the hero.
True. Honestly, Talisi deserved better as well, to be fleshed out as a better villain with real motivations. Yeah, that's a really great way to look at it, though, Opsa. I do think, like, if I were to recommend the Murderbot novels, now that we were 2 books into it, I would probably tell folks to try and binge it, because they're
Right.
short. They're like
Exactly.
weekend reads.
Exactly.
And I do think, like, as standalones, they are weak on their own.
Right.
But the way you're thinking about it, like, this is just episodes of a longer TV show.
Yeah,
and
little
you just kind of
miniseries.
watch it and read it quickly back to back.
Right.
This is a show you binge, and I think this is a book series you binge.
Totally. I think it's a lot tougher when you're also recording content about the book and going quite
Right,
in
and you have to
depth.
like sit down and critically analyze it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think I will admit, for myself at least, it leads to some overanalyzation, because it's like, if you read this book one time through, it's like a perfectly good time.
Right.
But I'm reading it twice, then I'm listening to the
sometimes
audiobook
3
a third
times.
time.
Yeah.
Like, I'm reading these chapters over and over so that we can script and have like in-depth discussions about it.
Right.
And repetitive readings of it start to really show the glaring flaws.
Yeah.
I think like one beach read that you knock out on a weekend on vacation, like, this will be a great time.
Precisely.
Well, that's the chapter summaries and our impressions of the book so far. Let's take a break, Opsa.
Yeah.
But dear listener, don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we're diving deeper into some themes and sci-fi ideas in our sci-fi analysis. We'll be back in a minute.
Nigel here. Did you know the wise time to relieve allergies is at night? With Xyzal. And who better to explain than a wise owl like me? Your allergies won't take a hint when you're tired and ready for bed. Don't suffer the symptoms that bother your sleep. Take Xyzal 24-hour instead. It starts working fast and works while you sleep, so you finally get much-needed rest. Then all the next day, it's still going strong, so you can feel your best. Be wise, all. Take Xyzal at night. Use as directed. Starts working in 45 minutes.
That moment when you realize your skincare is actually working. That's Rodan & Fields, the #1 female dermatologist-founded skincare brand in the U.S. Designed by 2 dermatologists who don't just know women's skin, they know how to formulate for it. Rodan & Fields, love what you see. Tap the banner or visit rodanandfields.com/Spotify to get your exclusive welcome offer.
All right, welcome back, listeners. And now let's jump into our sci-fi analysis. Abu, why don't you take it away?
For my takeaway, I want to take a closer look at Murderbot's fears. And in particular, I want to try and analyze why it felt so compelled to learn the truth about Kanaka Pit, which I do think is kind of a central aspect of this novella. So before we actually talk about Kanaka Pit, I want to talk about fear, because I think Tapan says something very interesting.
Yeah.
Tapan's definition of fear, this is what she tells Murderbot. Quote, "In the creche, our moms always said that fear was an artificial condition. It's imposed from the outside, so it's possible to fight it. You should do things you're afraid of." End quote. That's interesting. That's a powerful way to consider fear.
Definitely.
This does confuse Murderbot and Art, to be fair. Murderbot responds with, quote, that isn't the purpose of fear. End quote.
Yeah, you said it, Murderbot.
This is very interesting. And I think this is a significant exchange for a number of reasons. One, Tapon name drops the title of the book. So,
You'll
like, whenever
love it.
the title
You'll
of the
love
book
it.
is name dropped, you're like, I got to
Oh,
highlight
yeah.
this. This is
Yeah,
important.
absolutely.
But two, I think it's interesting because Murderbot and Tapon are looking at the emotion of fear from two completely different angles. Murderbot looks at fear as some sort of biological and evolutionary reaction that happens to you, right? It's uncontrollable, it's instinctual, it comes upon you, but it serves a purpose, right? It's a survival mechanism. Fear out in the wild, when you see a lion, keeps you alive. That's why you feel fear. That's what Murderbot thinks. Tapon, on the other hand, is able to actually see fear as an emotion that isn't an inalienable truth, right? If you feel fear, that does not always mean there is a fearful thing happening, right? The emotion can still come upon you, but how you react to it and how you interpret it is actually entirely up to you. You might be afraid that this lion is approaching you, but it might be a nice lion. You might be able to tame the lion if you react in the right way.
Well, this certainly explains Tapon's path in this book.
Right, Talisi is the lion, to be clear.
And the decision to ignore two very clear signs of threat on her life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit self-serving, and I think Tapon also admits that it's more inspirational than practical, this advice from her moms from the creche.
Right.
But I still think it's interesting to consider an emotional response in two different ways.
Totally.
Now, moving on from that, I want to talk about Murderbot and Murderbot's fears a little bit. There's a number of fearful reactions that Murderbot has throughout this book, but I think one of the most powerful ones, one of the most significant, is when it learns the truth about Ganaka Pit. It has uncontrollable physical, biological reactions to learning the truth. And even afterward, it can't quite place why it feels the way it does, even having learned the truth.
Right.
There's this like deep sense of confusion in Murderbot for the rest of the book.
Totally.
After the Ganaka Pit adventure, despite it learning the truth that its hands are clean.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with the massacre. Quote, it had been damningly conclusive. It just hadn't had the revelatory effect I had been stupidly hoping for. End quote. That quote caught my ear, because I find it so fascinating that Murderbot wasn't just looking for the truth of Ganaka Pit, just to find answers. Murderbot was looking for some sort of like divine revelation about itself.
Right.
It wanted more out of Ganaka Pit than just what went down.
Right.
And this makes me think that Murderbot went on this little Ganaka Pit adventure and revisited what is frankly one of the most traumatic memories it sort of has, despite the memory wipe, in order to maybe help it define itself, in order to define its own humanity, in order to define, like, who am I?
Right.
I need to go visit this deeply traumatic thing in my past to figure out who I am, because that must have shaped me.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most defining questions of all sentient existence, really.
Yes, absolutely. We're all asking, who am I?
Yeah.
I think Murderbot was hoping for more, much like me, was hoping for more from Ganaka Pit. And was left disappointed with the result.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting emotion to consider, because now Murderbot has to figure out the answer to that question itself. Who am I? Ganaka Pit didn't explain it to me.
Yeah.
It wasn't revelatory in that way.
Right.
And in sort of a fun coincidence, I'm sure my mind was already on this because of this, but I'm reading a book right now called The Courage to be Disliked by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitaki Koga. And I bring this up because this connects. Follow me here, folks, down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
This book that I'm reading is basically like a 101 on the work of Alfred Adler, who is a pretty legendary psychotherapist whose work in the field is as influential as Freud's or Jung's, even if his name isn't as famous as those two.
Right.
Adler was one of their contemporaries.
Right.
And so, honestly, between these three, they are considered the fathers of modern psychotherapy.
Right.
Adler just isn't as famous. So this book is really interesting. I'm working my way through it, so don't consider me some sort of expert on Adlerian psychology. And to be fair, I am finding this is neither here nor there, but I'm finding this book kind of clunky, and I'm a bit skeptical of some of the ideas, but some of the ideas are also really great. So I'm having a good time, and I think it's very relevant to today's conversation about Murderbot. One of the ideas in particular is most relevant. So one of Adler's theories essentially rejects the Freudian definition of trauma as a thing that shapes a person, and argues that looking at your life in this cause and effect way is the incorrect way to interpret your own personhood.
Fascinating.
Adler would argue that just because X thing happened doesn't mean you are now Y person, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Interesting.
Instead, Adler believed that your present self isn't actually determined by any of your past experiences definitively, and instead your present self is determined by the meaning that you give to your past experiences. I want to read this quote from the book. And again, for the folks that might be interested, the book is called The Courage to be Disliked. So here's a quote. Quote, Adler is not saying that the experience of a horrible calamity or abuse during childhood has no influence on forming a personality. Their influences are strong. But the important thing is that nothing is actually determined by those influences. We determine our own lives according to the meaning we give to those past experiences. Your life is not something that someone gives you, but something you choose for yourself, and you are the one who decides how you live. End quote.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
That's a really powerful statement, and I would argue a very empowering statement.
I would agree, yeah.
And it might be controversial, this take that like your trauma doesn't define you, but how you interpret it does. But I do think there's some power to that, and it's certainly something that maybe Murderbot needs to hear. The trauma of what happened on Ganaka Pit doesn't define what kind of bot or person you are now.
Yeah.
You get to decide, especially now that you've learned the truth, Murderbot, you get to decide how you live your life.
Right.
You get to decide what kind of bot you are now in the present. That's entirely up to you, Adler would say.
Right.
So to wrap up my takeaway and to kind of bring things full circle here, I think it's clear that Murderbot revisited Ganaka Pit in order to help it define itself. Again, it's exploring its own personhood throughout this story. And Ganaka Pit, this trauma it experienced, was a part of that. But despite learning the truth, I think Murderbot is still left feeling hollow because it was expecting this past event to define its present personhood.
Right.
And of course, Adler would argue that the only person that gets to define Murderbot today is Murderbot today.
Boom.
And not Murderbot from Ganaka Pit X years ago.
Right. Even if it had committed the massacre.
Even if it had committed
right.
Yeah, no matter, actually, the truth is kind of irrelevant here, right?
Yeah.
Whatever happened on Ganaka Pit.
Right.
Murderbot, you get to interpret that in how it affects you today.
Right.
And I think that's quite powerful.
Yeah.
Even like hitting back on Tapan and Tapan's definition of fear, I think Tapan actually has kind of a cool Adlerian view of fear.
Right.
That fear is something that happens to you, but you get to choose how to respond to it.
Right.
That's not the way Murderbot even looks at fear.
Right.
And it's certainly not the way Murderbot has been looking at its trauma on Ganaka Pit. And so I think these are all lessons that Murderbot still has to learn and is learning over the course of these novels. It's going through a slow evolution of embracing its own personhood, of embracing its autonomy.
Yeah.
Outside of its former slave life, to be blunt about it.
Yeah.
And I think these lessons that Murderbot is learning honestly all of us learn too, right? We all spend a lifetime learning these lessons, sometimes over and over and over again.
Absolutely.
And now we're getting to see Murderbot go through it as well.
Yeah.
So I did really like that aspect of this book.
Yeah.
And that was something that I was really left with. I think the combination of reading Murderbot and the courage to be disliked and learning about Adler at the same time
Yeah.
really kind of set off some synapses in my brain and connected some dots for me.
Yeah. Well, it ends up making for, I will say, a rather beautiful and fascinating takeaway. I mean, this idea that your past isn't what determines you, and really just contextualizing it in Murderbot's story, I mean, it almost suggests that Murderbot should cease to think of itself as Murderbot, you know, that it should maybe embrace a name and an identity that is of its own choosing. Is that where we're landing?
Adler would say, you're free to do that, Murderbot.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
That would be fascinating. Yeah. Okay, what about you? I know you have a similar-ish takeaway, but you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said it what you presented to us any better, and I think I will just maybe dive into a tiny part of that, which I think for me was certainly rooted in this notion of fear that's captured in the title Artificial Condition. But what I found so fascinating was the tension between programming and choice. Of course, Tappan says that statement early on that fear was an artificial condition imposed from the outside, and it's possible to fight it, and that you should do those things that you're afraid of. And I largely agree with that statement. I think Tappan has kind of stumbled onto this bit of actually deep wisdom, as we just explored. Doesn't quite seem to make wise decisions, because of it, but in any case, has found a really profound and I think meaningful truth that we can all really aspire to learn from.
Yeah.
I do, however, I find myself not convinced of the middle part of that statement, that fear is imposed from the outside.
Interesting.
And we can see in this novel, for example, that Murderbot has been, quote, explicitly programmed to be paranoid, end quote.
Ooh.
It's hardwired into its system. It's part of the nature of being a sec unit and not something that's in its choice. It's in its programming. That is, however, pretty similar to how our own human nervous systems are preloaded with that fight or flight response. It's not something we choose at the placenta stage, for example. If we don't get an array of possibilities there, we're simply born with this response preloaded.
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting is that Murderbot's fears, and ours as well, don't just come from external threats, but in fact from what we imagine. When Murderbot returns to the cubicles at Ganaka Pit, its, quote, performance reliability was dropping, and it became hard to move. And that wasn't because of an actual threat, but because it, quote, thought the others were still in there. The other sec units, that is. And that's kind of the thing about fear. It doesn't actually need reality to affect us.
Yes. Oh my God.
Even though Murderbot knew this reaction was completely irrational, the thought alone was powerful enough to cause, in its case, an actually measurable performance drop.
Yes, an actual bodily reaction.
Absolutely.
With its performance going down.
Absolutely. And that fear wasn't coming from outside. I think that's the point I disagree with. It was being constructed inside Murderbot's mind.
Such a good point.
And I'm really just struck by that observation, that fear largely exists as an internal construct, as, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of a figment of our imaginations. Rather than simply being an external force that we're subject to, which is, of course, contrary to Tappan's otherwise pretty wise and I think profound statement. The timeless message, of course, still holds true that the path forward requires moving toward rather than away from what frightens us. And though it may not have felt, totally life-altering at the moment for Murderbot to discover the truth about what happened at Kanaka Pit.
Yeah.
I think if we could peek at the path it would have taken if it hadn't confronted its fears of, I don't know, human interaction and the possibility that it was culpable for this massacre, I don't know. I would be willing to bet it would be a much worse life, that it would
Yep.
be a lot worse off for not having gone towards its fears rather than away from them.
And that's kind of the grand irony of Murderbot's life, at least in the
Yeah.
books that we've read so far. What Murderbot wants to do, what its interests at the current moment are, what its biology tells it to do, is sit in a dark room and watch Sanctuary
That's right.
Moon over and over and over again.
That's right.
But actually, we're watching Murderbot over the course of 2 books continue to do things it's afraid of.
Absolutely.
As you stated, perhaps the number one thing it's afraid of is interacting with humans, and it continues to do that in order to achieve its goals, in order to achieve some sort of growth.
Right.
So, in a funny way, Murderbot is doing exactly what Tappan said,
Yeah.
even if Murderbot doesn't believe in what Tappan said or Tappan's interpretation of fear itself.
Totally. Yeah. Fascinatingly, as it goes towards its fears, which it naturally does not want to, it's getting closer to answering that question that you raised. Who am I?
Yeah. Do you think, speaking of Murderbot, but also speaking about ourselves and humanity in general, is it necessary to face your fears to help yourself define that? Could you live in a cushioned room your whole life and still be able to define yourself as a person?
That is a great question. Yeah. I certainly don't have a preloaded answer to that.
Yeah.
I'm curious what the listeners think. I mean,
Right.
yeah, can you find your identity, your sense of self without confronting your fears? If you
Yeah.
were otherwise living a totally comfortable, cushioned, easy life, would you still have a rich sense of self?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I have quite a definitive answer on this, actually. I think absolutely no. Like, you couldn't define yourself or grow as a person or really come into your own personhood until you have faced and conquered some fears. And this doesn't have to be like some sort of life and death movie blockbuster moment where you overcome some death-defying odds
Right.
and come out the other side a different person. I'm
Right.
talking like little everyday fears.
Yeah.
I think it is actually important, as Tappan has stated, to do that, and Murderbot has done over the course of these books, to overcome your little everyday fears in small, tiny steps. You know, it doesn't have to be revelatory.
Right.
You don't have to go to Ganaka Pit and come out a different person. But you maybe take one step that you're nervous about. You maybe text that girl, you know? Like,
Yeah, that's
maybe she'll
right.
respond. You
That's
maybe
right.
go out on that date.
Yeah.
You maybe take this job that you don't know if you're really qualified for.
Right. Right.
You know, I think like this goes back to like the comfort zone argument. Like, Murderbot has a comfort zone that it wants to live in. We all have comfort zones that we'd prefer to just exist in.
Totally.
But in order to really build our own self-confidence, in order to build our own sense of self, to define who we are, what our values are, to learn what we are and aren't capable of, that I believe absolutely requires you step out into fear and to face it.
Right. Yeah. You know what? I think I would have to agree with you. I mean, if you don't confront your fears, then there's a whole side of you that you don't really know. You don't know
Yes.
what it feels like to endure that discomfort of confronting something that feels threatening, but in all actuality, probably will not kill you. Asking out that person that you are pining after and hoping will go out on a date with you will probably not result in your immediate death. So
Right.
to not confront one's fears really leaves you, I don't know, in a state of ignorance about much of yourself.
Absolutely. I agree. I think discomfort is absolutely necessary for growth. And it doesn't have to be extremes. It can be small everyday discomforts that ultimately help you shape yourself and learn more about yourself. And I would argue, become a more empathetic person. I think if you don't face your fears, you can't empathize with others who might be facing theirs.
You know what? That makes me kind of reflect on Murderbot's choice at the end there to free the comfort unit. I wonder. I mean,
Look at
I
that.
certainly saw that as being an act of, well, I'm emancipated. Certainly, I would emancipate others under the same conditions. But I
Yeah.
think part of what allowed Murderbot to make that choice, despite the fact that that comfort unit did try to kill
Kill
Murderbot
him.
after all, was that its choices in confronting its fears and facing its own free choices
Yeah.
gave it more empathy and allowed it
I think so.
to take and make the heroic choice there.
I agree. I think that's such a great read on it. Wow.
All right,
I might
folks.
have to update my review of this book in real time. Let's do it, though.
Yeah.
It's the final episode of this book. When we finish up a book, we always like to share our sort of unofficial, loosey-goosey final rating of the book.
That's right.
So where does this one land for you, Upsa?
Yeah, I think for me, I ultimately found that I enjoyed this book as much as I did All Systems Red, the first in the Murderbot Diaries. It continued the story in a way that I found personally satisfying. Certainly not as perhaps morally or philosophically as unexpected, and maybe the science isn't as complex as, say, that in the book that we must always reference in every episode.
Honestly. 3-body problem.
That's right. But I found myself again enjoying it, and I think part of it is the read of this as something that's kind of bingeable. Something that you would read back to back, and therefore I'd have to give this 6.5 Ganaka Pit Massacres out of 10. That's right.
Oh boy.
How about you, Emil?
I'm going to stick to our 5-star rating. I love that it's just there's no rules.
There are no
rules with our
rules.
ratings.
That's right.
Okay, so I too went back and checked what I rated All Systems Red, and I gave that book a 3 out of 5.
Yeah.
Given that I enjoyed this one less, where I'm going to land is I'm going to give this book 2 surviving comfort units out of 5 total comfort units in the Ganaka Pit Massacre.
I would take 2 comfort units.
At the same time. So that's where I'm going to land. 2 out of 5 here. I've already voiced many of my criticisms of this book. I still love Murderbot. I still love Arts.
Yeah.
I want more adventures with them, but I am craving something a bit meatier. I want something that's a bit more dense and gives me more to chew on. And perhaps the future books in this series will. And maybe I need to treat it like a bingeable TV show. But as a standalone book, this one lands at a pretty low 2 out of 5 for me.
Well, friends, this wraps up our books for this season. We'll follow up with weekly coverage of the Murderbot show, following, of course, our coverage of this book on Apple TV Plus every Friday. Then after a short break, we'll be back to announce the books and schedule for season 3.
We've been tossing around some ideas for season 3, folks. There's going to be some exciting books.
Pretty excited. If you've been in the Discord, we've been talking a bit about how we might bring you all in as well. So please check it out if you haven't.
That's right. And stay tuned for our Murderbot coverage. You and I both have early screeners from Apple. So we're going to watch ahead of time. We'll have our episodes ready to go. And our coverage of the show will come out every Friday alongside new episodes of the show on Apple TV. So that'll be fun. It'll be interesting to see how these books are interpreted.
Totally. Especially given our mention that this is a somewhat bingeable series of books. We'll see if the same holds true for the show.
That's right. Well, friends, whether this is your first listen of this episode or your 27th, help us out and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And be sure to check out the other shows on the Lore Party Podcast Network on loreparty.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at lore_party. We're also on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, while fear is an artificial condition, your 5-star ratings are all too real. Please, please, we're begging.
They make all the difference, truly.
Truly. Adler would want you to rate 5 stars.